Hello, everybody, and welcome to the fourth session of the Unordinary Bible Study, which is a partnership project I am doing in collaboration with the Active Inference Institute. And uh, a big motivation towards why I've been hosting these sessions is to really have more of an open dialogue about what it means to have hope and faith in the world around us, and have a conversation about spirituality and relate that back through the lens of active inference, but also having a contemporary perspective exploration on exploring what it means to tackle certain types of first principles understandings of what it means to have faith, or like what it means to have a certain type of faith. And I generally like to start off from what I like to say is influence from the active inference perspective. And like I mentioned, we have this contemporary dialogue, and throughout the dialogue, from we find moments to cross-reference the biblical context using verses from different books of the Bible, but we don't go through each book individually in certain rudimentary traditional ways. We just do a dialogue and we cross-reference back to scripture as we're doing the dialogues. And again, this is modern contemporary perspective exploration. Focus gets pretty deep philosophically, just going into a bunch of different territories. So we'll see where it goes. We kind of got into talking about stuff like the anthropic principle, and it got interesting the last couple of sessions. But so what I like to bring up is this idea of what is an agent, and basically uh, anything that has the agency to make a decision and to navigate its environment is something that has agency. And most of the time, the best way to think of an example of something with agency is not just ourselves, but anything that's alive, um, more or less. I mean, we don't quite have machines that have agency yet. Maybe we'll get there. Maybe we won't quite get there. But the idea behind agency is where we as agents are constantly engaging and being bombarded with stimulus constantly around the world around us. So we never turn off. We're not like machines. We can't turn off. We're constantly dealing with stimulus and responding to stimulus, and we have this prehistory over time of how we're experiencing the stimulus and engaging with it, corresponding with it, have you. So this idea of perception, where we perceive our environment, our sensory modalities, so vision, touch, all these modalities in which we can interact with the world around us, gets fed into our nervous system, or where our capacity to evaluate what to do with the sensory processing that's happening due to the stimulus that is prompting us to engage with it. So this idea of responding to the stimulus or action would then be, as we're perceiving the world around us, we are trying to adapt to how we engage. uh, we try to modulate rather how we're engaging with the stimulus, so we make decisions on how we regulate our capacity to engage the world. And then we it through this, it's kind of like a loop. You have perception, you have acting on the perception, and then you have this history of perceiving and acting on the world around us. And I like to call it the PAP cycle, PAP, perception, action, priors. So with that in mind, active inference considers, okay, these in the moment dynamics in which an agent will perceive the world around it and act on it regarding the stimulus that it has to contend with. And so you have this decision making happening, and henceforth why uh, agents are called agents. Well, most of the time they're called organisms, but more recently, um, because we don't quite have machines that we've built that have agency. Agents are organisms, but anyway, so we can also think of active inference, thinking about instantaneous behavior. So there's a lot of problems in physics, especially like basically understanding interaction-based behavior in the world around us. Like things happen at instant, the very instant something happens, how do we take a measurement at different dynamics of the instance? Like when we're thinking about taking a measurement instantaneously, we're thinking about, okay, um, if we go back to thinking about how agents are in the moment evaluating their perceptions and actions, well, we can think about interactions like trying to model what's happening in real time across time contexts and time scales. So you have varying contexts and varying time scales in which we have what we like to call in the formal the community likes to call, using the formalism, is a generative model. So these interactions, these stimulus generate perceptions and what have you. And our capacity as agents to evaluate how we engage with the stimulus corresponds to having a generative model of the stimulus and being able to make decisions and uh, figure out how we adapt. And then the processes, generative processes would be uh, the interactions and things that are just happening in the environment, regardless of our capacity to model it. There are just phenomena that are beyond our capacity to perceive and generalize. But there are problems in philosophy of science regarding the limitation of models and the curse of dimensionality, and we'll get into that a bit later. But so active inference, as I mentioned, has to do with agents and this decision-making process and in the moment carrying out of responding to stimulus and evaluating how to regulate a capacity to adapt to circumstances. And now, with regard to, um, brain fart here. Um, what I like to do is throw like my model of how can we think of how active inference is relevant to uh, a discussing the Bible or sacred or what it means to be spiritual. I like to talk about the capacity of agents with human-like capacities that have a level of conscience awareness, this capacity to evaluate the capacity to make a right or wrong decision in relation to oneself or others, and the co-inhabiting environment in which all agents existentially co-inhabit. So we were talking about the Gaia hypothesis the last two sessions, and what's interesting about that is thinking about how thinking about the Earth, how the Earth has a whole atmosphere where there's organisms living on Earth, right? And then all the organisms have different roles, and then we can think of humans being the agents that serve a role as being stewards of the earth, right? And then there's a lot of context in the Bible discussing that, especially a lot of different passages in Genesis. Well, we'll get to the Bible verses in a moment. I want to kind of envelop a discussion a bit here first, but normally I like to throw my spin on the sacred or thinking about God as this capacity of agents with this conscience awareness capacity, like humans, to be able to optimize how they appreciate the world around them and facilitate this capacity to not only appreciate the world around them, but to work together in a symbiotic, coherent manner in which there's this capacity to adapt the fitness of ourselves and us as collective groups, but also to appreciate the environment around us. But anyway, I know that can get into quite a few tangents, and I don't want to go on more than 5, 8 minutes on an intro here, but let's get into a bit of a discussion. I wanted to kind of start talking about what does it mean to be a Christian. Because I like to give a disclaimer admitting that I don't call myself a Christian per se, but I feel that I'm inspired by Christianity in terms of, a lot of philosophers and thinkers out there, and just a lot of the content I've been seeing. And I even go to my local, part of my local church community as well, go into their Bible studies and their church services. And so I do feel a sense of uh, a wholeness in a way. It's very therapeutic to be a part of that. Feel like you're part of a community that cares about one another, that cares about how we impact the world around us. But anyway, whoever wants to go first, I wanted to start talking about, what does it mean to be a Christian and kind of hear from what your point of view is.
All right, I can get started. I think what it means to be a Christian is somebody who is interested, keen, and willing to follow the steps of Christ. And we're talking about Jesus Christ as he came and he presented certain rules that we should follow in order for us to be like him, like the Father, as he wanted us to do. And so a Christian, even though they may fall, which is inevitable, the very fact that they get back up and try again consistently should allow them to be the chance or the opportunity to call themselves Christians. Do you have any thoughts in terms of how you would define a Christian? Does my definition align with you or with yours, or what are the similarities or differences in your
I
definition?
One thing I want to throw out there is I think that if you have one thing that really sticks out in Christian philosophy is how one comes up with their own personal way to understand what the Holy Trinity means to them in a personal sense, but also thinking to as well in interpersonal sense. So kind of think about two sides of a coin. Like on the one hand, you have this personal relation uh, regarding what it means for you to identify with some set of principles. And then on the other hand, is how we relate to each other in terms of what their sets of principles are compared to my set of principles. And I think my model of the Holy Trinity is um, basically based on cognitive perception of agents relating to what does the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit represent. So the Father would be the unravelings for based on how we individually on a personal level and all other agents on an interpersonal level. So individually as units, as members of the species, as well as the distribution of how we take, okay, what are the members of the species on average? How are they evaluating conscious awareness based decisions? So the father would represent this historical unraveling over time, like what happened, like how did it all unravel, and how could it unravel, right? Based on how it all unraveled. The sun representing setting the best example. Like, what does it mean to set, to optimally coordinate for agents to optimally coordinate themselves in a symbiotically coherent manner? And then the Holy Spirit represents the in the moment conducting of our conscious awareness capacities. Like in the moment, as we in the moment act, well, perceive, act, and you know, and how that over time um, might turn out based on the in the moment. But and then you can develop comparison and contrast relations between these different aspects, right? Like you would with the original Holy Trinity model, where from what I've gathered, I think this is the best explanation I've gathered is the Father actively and eternally generates the Son, constituting, whoops, the Father actively and eternally generates the Son, constituting the person of God, the Father. The Son is passively generated of the Father, which constitutes the person of the Son. The Father and the Son actively spirate the Holy Spirit in the one relation within the inner life of God that does not constitute a person. It does not do so because the Father and Son are already constituted as persons in relation to each other in the first two relations. The Holy Spirit is passively spirated of the Father and the Son, constituting the person of the Holy Spirit. So that, I feel like that sort of relates to like my interpretation of it, but it seems like um and what I read is based on Catholic.com magazine. What their explanation of they haven't explained the Holy Trinity article, but I thought that was pretty interesting, and I figured I'd share that real quick. There's a couple other articles that provide different explanations of the Holy Trinity as well, but I'm I don't know if Michael has his own take on what it means to be a Christian.
Hello.
Hey,
I am culturally Christian, but I don't identify as that being the container for my approach to reverence these days. And so it kind of feels, are either of you Irish?
I am part Irish.
Okay,
I'm
maybe
not.
maybe I was going to use the example of in Irish mythology and indigenous, so uh, Irish indigeneity. Some of the myths that we're still aware of include a concept of the leprechaun, right, which is a kind of spirit that plays a certain active role in Irish experience and mythology. Now, if I were to ask
Mm,
you, okay, let's talk about how leprechauns, you know, it might mean something very as a practitioner of and someone with that lineage, I might be able to um, speak to other Irish speakers about leprechauns. But to everybody else who's not Irish, they wonder what we're talking about. And
Mm.
so there's an invitation to the conversation that uh, that I definitely uh, feel the importance of reverence. Feel there's wisdom to be learned through looking at sacred texts. The body of text, for me, almost every text there is a sacred text, and what matters is our orientation to the learning journey, and the fact that some texts are have longer histories and contain more diversity of perspectives may give more clues to what there is to learn. But but if they're puzzle pieces to a greater mystery, no single puzzle piece no single map is the territory. It's simply a map to that territory. And so I'm feeling I'm wondering if I should even be in this conversation because because it's as I say, I'm being asked to opine on a frame that is not the one that I use anymore. And uh, I believe that for me, and I could share an example of how science has helped with aspects of what have traditionally been the province of religion, but by bringing science first-based principles into these practices, we can practice them more skillfully. And I don't know if you, I have used the topic of forgiveness as an example. If you want, I actually have like a little slide deck that I've used in the past about coaching people to negotiate forgiveness using both science of releasing emotional wounds and then what do different religious traditions say. And for example, the Abrahamic traditions, the three religions that spin out of the same Bible, each have different core ways of treating the topic of forgiveness. In Judaism, the person who, if somebody injures somebody you care about, you can be upset about it, but the healing journey and the negotiating with God, if we to use that terminology, is done between the person, the individual, and them directly, and you don't have jurisdiction over the third party grievances. You have to work out your stuff and your stuff alone. In the Christian model, the presumption is that Christ died for our broken state, our sins, and that we are obligated to always err on the side of forgiveness, to err on the side of releasing because the deity died for us. In Islamic tradition, and so there's an expectation to always turn the other cheek. In the Islamic tradition, there is a recognition that to be forgiving is a beautiful virtue and a desirable virtue to be merciful, but that there's also a place for vengeance, retribution, maybe is the better word. And so, if somebody has killed your dog or injured a relative of yours, you can ask for blood money. You can negotiate the terms of your forgiveness rather than just automatically, um, turn it over to God because and God will do the forgiving. And so these all come through the Bible. Of course, there's a whole bucket of other religions out there and other ways of practicing this that 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 do this in very different ways. I'll stop with the one of the ones that's closest, if you will, to the Christian, the Buddhist, is that to be triggered, to be in a state of reactivity, somebody has done something to you, and you're still feeling that resentment, is that you're not free. And so the act of releasing the emotional wound in Buddhism is because to become free of that persistent resentment about the transgression. But it's again a different logic, and it doesn't involve a deity. It involves being freer from the trauma that you've experienced. So why am I bringing this up? Because all of these are wisdom traditions that have each evolved over history and come into being, and through evolution have come to have a certain perspective, and kind of like there are different tree types in the world, and there's some things that we recognize are common across trees, and each of them have their own unique things. That to say, let's see the world through this individual tree is not a first principles based approach to that conversation. What I found illuminating, for example, of studying what science looked at when it looked at what does it take for an individual to release an emotional wound. As someone who had grown in the Christian tradition, the idea that I had to just get over it, I had to forgive and move on, was something that most of the time I was quite adept at doing. And there had been some transgressions that I really, really, really struggled. And when I encountered what science has in studying this and studied the idea of what does it take to release the emotional wound, there are up to 7 psychological criteria that have been identified so far. And I'm not saying this is complete because science always thinks it can learn more. And so one day there may be 7 or 6 may be validated and a 7th ignored because it turns out not to be so true. That's one of the things about science, that some of these fixed texts, they it's like the baseline has been kept intact, and it's like there's no subsequent learning. And it can become caught in a perspective that has changed for the times in which we find ourselves. And so these 7 criteria included things like, the conditions that might have to be looked at in order to feel that one could release. And one of my brothers had offended me deeply in a very hurtful way, and I didn't feel I could forgive him. And he had come up to me and said, "Please, I'm sorry." And as a Christian, I'm supposed to say, "Okay, you're sorry. I'm supposed to forgive you." But I didn't feel like it. I didn't want to, and I couldn't. And by seeing how there were additional criteria, I could begin to negotiate with him. You know what? In order for me to feel like it's safe to be around you again, I need to feel that you're not blaming me for the thing that happened, which was part of the dynamic, that it's not going to happen again, that the consequences of, and it gave me a more accurate map of the psychology of what needed to be negotiated and healed in a way that I could then act upon. And that brother and I have healed since and moved forward. But the cultural mean that I'd received from Christianity was insufficient for that particular stuck point in which I found myself. And so this is why I say, and I'm giving a long-winded answer here, but it's not that I'm trying to be dismissive of Christianity. There is enormous wisdom in Christianity and enormous blind spots. And that's exactly what there is to kind of the bucket of science is to say we start with how would a non-believer approach this question, so that we're not automatically assuming that the agreements that exist in any particular way already are the truth. That is not how first principles based inquiry works. And so, I'm happy to be further in this inquiry of, because I do think that there's something very important about community that you were talking about when you said why you go to community. There are certain aspects of being in community. There are certain aspects of being in reverence that I think in our culture need to be recaptured and regenerated and restored. And that can be through many churches and many other ways of worshiping. But to say we're going to start the conversation by looking through this lens and how do you agree with my leprechauns is is kind of insulting to anyone who doesn't use leprechauns as their sense-making model. So, thank you.
What are the lenses that you use for your daily life?
I don't know what you're asking me.
So,
Are you asking me if I am a practitioner of a particular religious tradition? Is that
sure,
what you're asking
yes,
me?
yes.
The answer is I am. I will pray with anybody. I am spiritually, you could say, promiscuous is the way I joke about it. I
Hmm.
find there's wisdom in all those traditions, and the ones that one of the things I like about Buddhism, which is one of the traditions that I admire, is that it assumes that its knowledge is incomplete and that you're always on a learning journey. Whereas many of the other, and I'll pick a fight with Islam instead of Christianity in this case, tends to be no. Muhammad got the right download. He got it complete. It's correct as he understood, and now everybody else needs to get on point. And the rest of us, our job is to get everybody on Muhammad's message. And it's like if you're an Arabic speaker and you hear the words of Muhammad, I'm told it's like poetry and it's beautiful and but for those of us for whom that doesn't is not how how the divine shows up for us, this idea that if you don't speak Arabic and you don't worship the way that Islam says, you are the fallen is a blind way is in my understanding a an egotistical way of practicing spirituality, and that's not not my practice.
I have a few follow-up questions. Now, if we look at all of the different religions, or some of them, throughout the world, you have Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on. Do you believe that their messages are more similar or different? So, and the reason why I ask this is based on your explanation in terms of Christianity asking me or you to turn the other cheek or forgive, right? Do you think that's a message that's solely related to the Christian way, or does it also apply in your belief to Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on?
So I thought I explained my understanding of what the differences are between four of those groups, and there are other groups that I do not claim to be a religious scholar. This conversation, see what's happening here is the science-based approach would be what is the territory that we're looking at mapping at, and then how does observation and peer review, and how can wisdom traditions inform what is coming through that conversation? But it does not begin with the idea of this conversation will only be sacred if it's spoken in English. And if this conversation happens in any other language, there's something wrong with it. Yo hablo
No,
español, yo podría tener esta conversación en español. You see what I'm saying? Most folks have no idea that I'm actually not, that I might speak other languages and other ways of making sense, of understanding, and of relating to the world.
very true.
And
I mean, I speak French. Je peux en train de parler français, uh, but the main thing that I'm trying to get at, or I guess I'll use my own example because you touched on something that is quite important, whether it is based on the religious aspect and so on, or Christianity and so on. But the main thing that I'm trying to get at, hey, is forgiveness.
mhm.
So when you really examine that topic, I really do believe, religion aside, it is an important topic and it's necessary.
Hmm.
Um, I can try to use the Christian lens or religious lens to say that, it is
Hmm.
for the betterment of the person, then it is the person who is forgiving, right? Let's say you do something wrong to me. It's better for me to forgive you than hold on to the hurt and so on. Um, and really removing those religious aspects, I still think um, at the end of it all, whether it's the most difficult thing that we do, it leads to a better life. Imagine if, for example, I'm quite sure you're familiar with one of the reasons why gangs continue to remain one of the most violent um, territories or entities in the world. It's because this person killed my brother, my father, my sister, and so I retaliate, correct? Okay. Well, and it happens with other in other ways as well. But the thing is, if we were to try our very best to accept that life will be difficult, life will be hard, accept also that um, we're being asked to do something that the average person may find unnecessary. I, there's a novelty, I think, in somebody deciding to say, "Hey, even though this person hurt me and it did not make me feel the best." If I take the time to understand where the hurt is coming from or why they did this to me, those things can be resolved.
So there are two things that are coming up for me that I think are a point of confusion. One of the things about a science approach is that it's not the the personal experience of the science is not what establishes or dismisses the credibility of the science. That way of measuring the or assessing the value of a lot of experiences in life, including for many religion, is how do I feel about it? How do I as an individual? And and that's an important consideration, but that's not how science works. Science is not do you approve or not approve that the sun, the Bible says that the earth is the center and that the sun doesn't go around. Science has a conflict about that. We've stopped looking at that a long time ago because it's the original text isn't going to change, and we have an understanding that's now more accurate because we see better how the mechanics of that unfolds. And so, the idea that even because something is familiar and intuitive, and because it looks like the sun was going around, it totally makes sense that people would have that intuition. And yet there was a different way of explaining it. And the way that many religions say you should relate to the limits of your knowledge is to say, have faith that what is here is a complete explanation. Science has that you acknowledge that there's a bucket that you don't know, that you can have guesses about what that is. So there might be a deity, there might be leprechauns, there might be mysterious flows, and that you can develop ever smarter, ever testable ways of determining whether the way that your map is lined up with reality is closely aligned or has opportunities for improvement. But the advancement or the rise in the standing of science is on its reliable predictability, not on its personal sense experience by individuals. In other words, is it, can it be subject to testability that then is repeatable by others? And whether people like those results or don't like those results is a different matter. And this has been one of the rude points between science and other forms of experiential wisdom, because there are ways in which our intuitions and our experiences give us insights into the world that are beyond the limits of science. And so it's a useful it's useful to remember that science doesn't have all the answers either. However, and this is why I kind of came at it in this conversation. It's like this presumably is an active inference inspired. In other words, there's a theory of how the bricks of the universe work, that you can put these together in a way and see things and understand things that you might not have been able to previously. And that's why I use the example of forgiveness, because if you were locked in a Christian model where the only way you practice forgiveness is suck it up and move on. Christ died for you, move on. And it turns out that you can come to a genuine forgiveness in a different way, informed by your anger and negotiating and finding a mutualism from a different place. And especially if you're dealing with non-Christians and they don't have your rules, part of the thing is, no, we just need to teach them the rules. And it's like, good luck with that. That's why each of these religions spends so much time trying to impose its lens on the others. And there's the science model is put it through the grinder, subject to scrutiny, and if it turns out not to work, there's more learning to be done, rather than shaming the person who has a different perspective. Oh, it's a failure of you to be sufficiently pious, or it's a failure of you to be sufficiently diligent, or you have a lack of faith, or you have a lack of, and it's a it's a logic loop that interrupts the search for truth. Instead, it's a search for obedience and compliance to people who, I mean, I don't need to tell you, I don't know how your ancestors came to this continent, but not everybody was invited. Some were brought in chains. That is legal and biblically sanctioned. We don't think that's such a nice thing anymore, but the Bible's full of that, and the people who fought in the Civil War to keep it going had the Bible on their side. So I'm really leery about taking the Bible 100%. Where we see that the Bible might benefit from updated perspectives. That's where I am in my journey. I wanted to be a priest once, but I just paid too much attention.
Hmm. Good points. So well, all right, for background's sake, I guess I'll state that I don't know your background, but I pursued a PhD in public admin and philosophy. And currently I'm working on an R&R for an article that I'm working on. And you mentioned a lot the science method, but as we were having this conversation, one of the main things that I wanted to do was remove myself from this process and try to um, have a conversation rooted in faith, so to speak. Uh, but as I'm listening to you, the one thing that I'm trying to figure out is what essentially what is your argument when it comes to religion, or the main message that you want to get across in terms of comparing apples to oranges? Like what's the key thing that you're trying to drive at so that we can both be we can understand each other and know how to proceed with that particular this conversation.
I feel you're asking me, like you did last time, to kind of repeat myself. So I'm wondering if um, I if it's not coming across what I'm saying, then I don't know how else to describe it. Um, I
No, so
uh,
so for example, and it's my fault too because I'm doing two things at once. But when we talk about forgiveness, for example, what sort of conversations would you like to have based on that topic?
So the topic of forgiveness is simply one example of a practice that has a religious lineage of many types.
Hmm.
And I was saying the conversation of the Active Inference Institute, I believe, is to start with what is empirically, what are the, you said it, just, you said first principles. First principles is not a biblical term, at least, not in the active inference community. First principles means that based off of the base principles of science, you then build up from there. And so to open up the question by saying, let's start with, Christianity, it's like, well, the introduction maybe should have been, what are the first principles and how does Christianity embody or not, you know, these, but that wasn't the way the conversation went. And
Okay, okay.
that's why I gave an example of like, this is using forgiveness. Science describes it as releasing an emotional wound. Not everybody who refers to forgiveness thinks of that as being all that forgiveness entails. So part of this is, whose labels do you use? And and that's what my resistance was. I'm like, we're not using labels here of either active inference or of science. We're starting with a particular sacred text. And that is why I don't expect to get very far in this conversation. I know that's a rude thing to say, because we're starting a theological
Hmm.
conversation rather than a scientific inquiry of spirituality, which is what I'm trying to describe, and what my orientation has been to relating to the mystery and to the divine and to the sacred.
No, please. No, I understand that. So rather than ask, what does Christianity means to you? What's a question that you would propose?
I think I just described it. What are the
No, no, no.
active
I'm just
inference
asking for a
principles?
question.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. So here's an example with an active inference. One of the things that active inference has as a first principles claim on reality is, and this is controversial, and this is where the strength of this science is
Mm.
is up to a lot of contention. But you could say in physics, there has been for about 100 and some odd years a controversy about what people would call Newtonian physics, which is a world that can be explained like a clock, and that you just have to know all the pieces, know how to fit them together, and the world operates according to cause and effect, the
Mm.
logic of causality, of cause and effect, and of a certain type of mathematics. What was disorienting for the new class of physics was that instead of reality being composed of atoms that were these hardcore nouns and objects, these nouns seem to be instead verbal forces, fluids, and they behaved according to a different mathematics, a different logic than everybody had been using for the previous 300 years. And so this whole question of, is it a particle or a wave, has been a thing going on in physics for some time. And most everybody thinks physics is one of the strongest sciences that has the best mathematics, blah, blah, blah. One of the things that active inference does differently is it holds those two things, this idea of, is it a noun or is it a verb, the basic unit of reality. And it says those two things are in one sense, and this is a poor description, the inside and the outside of a relationship that is a recursive loop. And so the inside of existence is is subjectivity, you could say, and which is why this spiritual and this experiential, because it is the consciousness that creates the inside of a map of the unit of anything that fits within a Markov blanket, and on the outside is this other way of the science perspective, and that these two, the maps that we create and how well those maps help us navigate reality, is now this model that active inference is kind of bringing to life it's in a mathematical sense. And so there is a relationship between what it is that you perceive and what is in fact out there in the world. And causation goes in both directions. And there's this question of whether or not, you know, so there are aspects that had been trivialized about religion that now in the bucket of science are like, oh, we need to take this a little more seriously again. But that doesn't mean that everything, gets put back on the table. There's a whole series of things. They're like, no, no, we
Mm.
know that the sun is not going around the earth. We just know that. That part has not changed. But there is something about consciousness and the role of the inside of consciousness and the outside of consciousness. And how do those happen both as an individual experience and then as people dialogue, and we're signaling in language, and we're either becoming synchronized or not, and whether we form into a meta cluster, to use biblical language. The tribes of Israel, first there were 12 tribes, right, that became a larger nation. This idea of co-emerging into something greater than is something that there's now a mathematics for describing that becoming and interbecoming. But it still is not everything in the book, because the book says slavery is a good thing. And that's why it's like we have to be very careful of start saying first you have to testify why you are a believer and why did it. It's like, no, no, don't have to do any of that. Not from the lens of science. Even if you believe that there just might be something there, you do not have to swear allegiance to any point of view, but let it emerge, let it appear, and let it guide you. Let the truth come, you know, across all of us. And this idea, if you start getting messages, this is why I was using that several texts all have variation between them. And so let's learn what we can from them, but let's also, be skeptical. Skepticism is also one of
Hmm.
the divine gifts, you know. So I know I'm trying to be both kind, clear, and co-revering,
You're doing
but
great. But I do want to add a lot of bits in, and I do want to get some
okay.
Bible verses in too. But I wanted to say a couple things about forgiveness, and I think going back to thinking about the Bible as a codex, because one of my criticisms of the Bible is how many linguists have studied the Bible, how many contrarian statements are in the Bible that challenge point of view, like a denominational interpretation of the Bible, because there's so many different denominations, right? So I think there's a lot of challenge there, especially thinking about like the sun the earth going around, the sun going around the earth, right? Right. So like that problem, and well, okay, there's a whole bunch of different passages where there's a bunch of, talking about slavery and all kinds of these terrible things, but I think uh, what's interesting about the structure of the Bible is that it gets you to really sort through your head about what are the worst things that humans can do as opposed to what are the best things that humans can do, in terms of like, if we, thinking through the active inference lens about how a society of agents like just regulates itself. It's not like it's a one whole self specifically, but you have all these agents that are different units of selves, and they're just, it's I think for a long time humans knew that you know, the best of things could lead to good things, but the worst of things could probably lead to the worst things, right? Like, when we think about different passages like Revelations as opposed to thinking about what happened in the book of Job. And when we see what we see unravel in the book of Job, is being at contention with one's fate, like sticking it out through the like what's the worst that can happen and how can I keep myself grounded. And I think what faith really means is having this sense of groundedness. How does an agent keep its composure through the worst of times as opposed to the best of times? And like in active inference, I like to think of this as like cognitive load balancing. And there's this term that I don't know if you watch Theories of Everything. I mentioned this. There's this one philosopher of religion. Uh, his name is Anand Vadya, and he does. Well, I wouldn't say he's specifically a philosopher of religion. He does work in logic and a bit of maths, but he drew this term around called cognitive strain, right? It's like how much stress can a person take until they crack, and like how much how do we deal with trauma as it manifests and permeates throughout our lives, right? And I think the one thing that the Bible uh shows us is that we can kind of develop these consensus idealizations, about what's the worst that could happen based on how we cooperate as individuals as opposed to groups, like more like not just groups but structures of groups of individuals and how each of those clusters of groups interact with each other. Like we think about different abstraction based analogies of what happens with expectation and reward. And these I gotta give a shout out to these pamphlets right here, the Discovery series by Our Daily Bread Ministries. I gotta give a shout out. So what's interesting about these pamphlets and talking about abstract ideas like heaven and stuff like
Mhm.
the apocalypse is like thinking about expectation and how we as agents ought to conduct ourselves. So, talking about forgiveness, there's this one Bible passage. Now, there's a number of passages that talk about forgiveness, but my favorite one is Luke 17:3, which says, "So watch yourselves. If your brother or sister sins against you, rebuke them, and if they repent, forgive them." And that actually entails for each time someone wrongs you, you call them out for it, and if they correct themselves, or there's this process of correcting one's behavior or being held accountable, I think like this passage is pretty nice in terms of what are the terms of forgiveness. Like, do we just kind of like suck it up? And I would say this passage in Luke says, no, we don't just suck it up. There's a process. And I think what's interesting about the Trinity, I've been thinking about this and talking to people with a math background about this, what I like to call, or well, it seems to be that the prevalent in philosophy and law and the philosophy circle known as triality. So if you're familiar with non-duality as thinking about things as they function and relate as an integrative whole, as opposed to duality where you have a separation between subject and object or a dual space, like x equals y. Well, there's also this idea of triality. One way to think about triality is you have you have the X, you have the Y, and then you have the operand, you have the in-between operator, that equal sign that relate, you have the relation, you right? Or you have the operations that yield the relation between the input and the output when you're thinking about systems or you think about maths. And so I think what's so interesting about this triality model, or thinking about trilations, like, okay, another trilation is thinking about like the top, the bottom, and the middle, right? Or you could think of the micro, the macro, and the meso layer, right? You have the interactions happening at like the really, really infinitesimal scale as opposed to the cosmological scale, or like, planets and stuff like that. And then you have the in-between things happening, right? You like in between structures
Yeah.
of fields and potentials. And
Jesse,
so
can I ask you a question?
yeah.
Because if you were building an agent and you were testing different scenarios for forgiveness practice, um, you just cited a series of sources, right? And so you could say that for one bucket of agents, we're going to make 10 agents that follow this Job guidance,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we might create another 10 agents that follow a different kind of, and then you can run a simulation or a whole variety of different simulations to see how they perform, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's how the tool of agent-based modeling, they don't all have to follow the same rules, although they
Right.
can. You can create diversity of perspectives and then see how they act, how they cluster, how they organize, how effective they are or are not in different simulation models, right? So um, you wouldn't say the rules of this agent over here are inherently a priori better than these other agents. You would let the simulations run and mix up the conditions, and you would and then let the evidence of results show you whether it's this passage or that passage or this combination of actors, or when it's rainy weather, it's this kind of combination that works best, and when it's sunny weather, it's this other combination that works with. But you develop better visibility into the different combinations that work in different circumstances, right?
Mm-hmm.
How would you do that with some of the how would you set up some of these simulations that you're talking about without just stopping at, oh, I'm going to use this quotation, and say now, but instead, how would I turn that into an agent in a simulation that I would then run so I can subject it to the testable, because we know that, there's 20 different phrasings of how to forgive. And so it's like, well, those 20 different forgive, and that's just within the Christian section, right? Which of those 20 works best under which conditions? And you can then practice the scientific method and
Mm-hmm.
simulation to say why, John has some better guidance than Revelation does, or whatever. But it's
Mm-hmm.
because you've run through a scrutinizing process that then, and you don't have to tell people, you know, you can tell them how you've reconciled the conflicts in the fuzziness in the guidance that's being offered, right? that's
Mm-hmm.
that's what the agent-based modeling tool within the larger bucket of active inference can be used for, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the superpowers. One of the reasons I showed up in this conversation was because, as someone who was looking to build these simulations and do, you know, I'm interested in how does having a more powerful relationship towards the not knowing and the mystery, how do different ways of holding mystery by the agents support them being mutualistic? Because some people, under the face of uncertainty, behave in a fearful way, in a
Mm-hmm.
predatory and selfish way. And
Mm-hmm.
others, it opens up their generosity. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's like, what are the things that, under adversity and under uncertainty, open up the beautiful in these agents. These are the conversations that can be subjected to scenario testing and
Mm,
comparison in a scientifically rigorous manner. And so this can be very promising work, but it's what I'm experiencing here is kind of a let me explain to you how the Bible works. And I don't need that. And and the audience that you want to speak to later is going to have varying mixed levels of interest. Whereas if you can tell
mhm,
them why certain kind of forms of guidance are like, this is the bomb right here because it blah, 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 people are going to care what you have to say.
mhm,
And so it's like how to be in a conversation that equips us to bring not the power of technology and these tools to see the light and the most beautiful better.
mhm,
That's the conversation that I'm hoping to to be in,
mhm.
and then I'm kind of like feeling uh like I'm I I'm like, how do we call each other into a greater than?
What do you mean, so like how do we symbiotically cohere into this, like how do we resolve conflict? I think that's what
These are all
at
different things that can
idealized
be simulated.
extremes. Yeah, and I think
Conflict,
that's
forgiveness, mutualism, defuzzification, integrating paradox,
hmm
and
yeah, and
and
I
and
agree with
this is
that.
yeah, you know, at the moment, rather than integrate, I'm hearing, oh, it's already here in this particular bucket, it's already all figured out. And it's like that bucket has a track record that some of which you're not claiming. It's like people have used that same bucket to
I think
justify
that
genocide and conquest and
I think that the problem with the Bible is that it's not something that you take word for, or I would say structurally, like if I were, if I were to even put a linguist that spent a significant amount of their studies on the Bible and its structure,
hmm
like
hmm
I don't think there would be much of a confirmation bias difficulty in terms of, okay, is this just a bunch of analogies that could just be arbitrary? Maybe none of these people actually existed. So why
hmm
does it matter? Okay, well, maybe there are some patterns in terms of
hmm
what do the words mean? What is there something
hmm
about the names that are a symbolism? Like, Jesus was a common name back in the days before the Bible was even actually um, uh, a written text. Like, like there was a long period of time that it was just going around in an orated fashion. I think that's the word that I'm
hmm
grasping. Like, most faiths, they're, past, they don't really have a written word, right? And that I believe that's something that you brought that up a little bit earlier. But I
hmm
think that what the
But that
problem,
doesn't make them unconscious. That just makes
right?
them non-writing. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that um there's a lot of I hopefully contrarian is the right word, where there's a lot of statements and structures of parables in each of the books that may conflict with what you think is right or wrong in or out of context, right? So, talking about slavery and all that stuff. And I think that these bits are good contrarian pieces to challenge us into thinking, why, should I be thinking that this is wrong and that's why this is here? and structured here because there's a whole bunch of other passages that, and I don't want to call it cherry picking per se, like, oh, I don't agree with, I don't condone this behavior, and maybe the whole parable is just to display, this, to get us to relate to what ought to challenge our right and wrong, our compass, our moral compass, if you will. So I don't think that in the apologist circle that people are. I'm not from my point of view. It seems to be more about talking about defending the analogies that really stand out. So even though a lot of people are not big fans of Jordan Peterson, and I don't always like the people he interviews either, or rather how his interviews go, but I like his psychological archetypes model because it gets you thinking about how the Bible proposes a lot of, um, I want to say over the, I guess we could think of like these over the top idealizations of what is a right and wrong way for us as individuals and as a species to conduct
Hmm.
ourselves. And the Bible isn't the only text to do this, but I think what makes Christianity interesting is how popular it is across the globe, culturally,
So,
geopolitically, and
so,
I think that's what pays the, that's what kind of gets its attention. But
I have to go. It was supposed to be 90 minutes, and I didn't expect to be here the whole time anyway, but I'm
oh,
glad
thank
to
you
have been
so
in this
much for,
conversation.
yeah, thank you so
Um,
much for joining
and
us.
and I I hope that if there are reasons to co-venerate in other ways, and to use an example, one of the other groups at the active inference is looking at using the modeling of using the technology to support the group restoration of the soil. And so there's a growing of aliveness and the growing of the ecosystem aliveness that by seeing the many parts moving together, there's a co-orienting towards life. And
Hmm.
that kind of orientation, I think, is present in the Bible, and is the kind of thing that is beyond language sometimes, and that we're praying together. How are we enlarging life together more skillfully? That if those
Hmm.
kind of conversations are of interest, great. But that I am coming to that citing not just the Bible, not just the Quran,
Hmm.
not just the Tao Te Ching or the Upanishads, but also secular books, and that
Hmm.
they all have wisdom traditions and not just writings, but that other traditions that are non-written. Um, you know, most indigenous peoples have a much better um, their relationship to the planet and to Earth is much more reverential than the biblical one that says God gave it to me to do with for my own dominion. And it's a small surprise that the places where the Earth is most depleted is where biblical thinking has been the deepest and longest. It's not an accident, some would say. So it's a hard fact, but there are ways to call back to life and to call back to,
Hmm.
um, you know, to hear the song of the divine, to hear the song of nature, and to co-reverence more skillfully. And
Hmm.
I'm in if that if the
We can definitely have a lot
conditions.
of discussions about that, and I don't
Yeah,
mind getting into the math of it. I just want to be mindful of the audience that we're attracting to and how we can explain different concepts.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, I'm always struggling to explain concepts across disciplines, and that's such like a difficult thing. But
Yeah.
um, yeah,
Well,
thank you for joining us, and I hope
Thank
to see
you.
you again. And
And
we could definitely hit on a lot of those talking points. Absolutely.
fantastic. Talk to you again. Cheers. And
Cheers.
welcome, Kevin.
Welcome, Kevin. Yes. Yeah, we were talking about what it means to be a Christian, and I wanted to lead into then talking about the Bible. What does it mean for the Bible to be the Word of God? What I don't think we spent too much time. Well, maybe we did talk a little bit about my little spin on the ontological incompleteness argument of God's plan. I thought that was interesting when I mentioned, especially, I mentioned at the beginning of this session briefly about there's this transition between prehistory and history of humanity as a sufficiently conscience-aware society of agents. And now then we can think of the Bible as a codex in which humanity at some point um, kind of figured out ways to idealize, um, what are the best and worst outcomes we can cooperate for or against, in terms of um, thinking about how um, we think about good and evil as the problems between conducting ourselves in a right or wrong manner. And I think then this makes kind of flips some people's worlds upside down. It's like, wait a minute, so how do we think about God? How do we think about, well, and that's why I don't want to just say it like it has to do with what God is, but thinking about what I like to more preferably call the dynamics of the sacred, which is this semblance of a society of conscience aware agents being able to coordinate themselves in this appreciable, in this manner that where the agents appreciate each other and their surroundings, and they try to uh, build up to embrace to one another and the ecosystem, right? To the ecosystem along with the agents want to thrive in the best of outcomes. But the problem is most agents they're not thinking, most of us humans, right? Um, and I think what's interesting about the word human is, we could think of how, a hue is like, in terms of colors, like different hues, different colors represent different hues, and then each individual human is in their own individual person, right? So it just seems kind of ironically poetic to be a human among humans in that sense. But the ontological argument, I think, is fuzzy but interesting because we can think about the anthropic principle in terms of remembering that, okay, well, we exist as agents, but within a universe in which there is a, uh, the potential uh, for a combination of configurations of which the universe itself is enables life to exist, enables agency to exist, right? So we happen to live in a universe in which agency is possible, but let's say there was a pre-existing state of the universe before the Big Bang. So as far as we can perceivably understand the age of the quote unquote age of the universe, but maybe in some pre-existing state of the universe before the Big Bang, we can think about how maybe in a galaxy far, far away, there were a society of agents on some planet. Um, Maybe a lot different than humans. Maybe they had a religion. Maybe they had some kind of religion that was kind of like or different to Christianity. So I kind of like to think about all the types of ways in which there's a moment between prehistory and history in which you have this um, beginning in which we have a society of of conscience-aware agents and engaging with each other. And how many moments has that ever happened, right? It's like this omnipotence or omniscience is this all the different ways in which a society of agents can just emerge into existence. But yeah, I figured I'd kind of dial back to talking about that. I think that's an interesting. I was hoping Mike could stay a little longer, but that's some interesting apologetics to get into in terms of, and also talking about creation as generation, like a reframing of what this of the creation argument as thinking about the universe as a generative process, or thinking about how I derived generative model as opposed to generative process earlier. Agents they are perceiving and engaging with the world around them, and as they are doing that and keeping note of how they're perceiving and engaging with the world around them, they envelop a model of reality, and that is like, or they also envelop embedded models of perceiving the world around them as generative models as well, but an all-encompassing generative model that allows them to guide their reality, which is their world model, is the big um, encompassing generative model. And then you can have all these different other generative models, but then you can have the actual underlying phenomena that are beyond our capacity to generalize, that are actually happening, as opposed to the generalizations we make, because as humans and limitations of science being that the scientific method is about compression of information in terms of, okay, let's take all the redundancies and have a explanation or a phenomena, and patterns, as opposed to predicting and expecting, okay, what kind of patterns do we notice around us, and how do we navigate the world efficiently in an adaptive sense as individuals and as a species. So science is great at that, but the boundaries of science, I like to say, deals with uncertainty and undecidability. And Michael brought up the Markov, these blanket structures. So you can think of boundaries in which you have interactions happening, like you have permeations of the internal as opposed to the external layers of different interactions happening. So like with agents, you have the agent and their environment and other agents, and like the agents are internalizing and externalizing among other agents and the environment. But I think there's this one Bible verse I wanted to bring up that I wanted to talk about too, on top of these little tidbits that I brought back up. But Genesis 1:28 says, "And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth." I think that kind of speaks towards how humans are the stewards, of the ecosystem when we think about this reframing of the Gaia hypothesis. But that was a Bible verse I wanted to bring up that I thought was interesting, Genesis 1:28. But anyway, I figured I'd throw those out there, those ideas. I know we talked a little bit about that whole the ontological argument, uh, fuzzy argument bit, a little bit in some of the past two previous sessions, um, but yeah, what do you guys think? Especially about the whole be fruitful and multiply, replenish the earth. Um, bit. What does that mean? How do we build off of that? Uh, I think Kevin, were you trying to say something? You went off mute, but I can't hear you.
I'm still here. Oh, I think he's muted. Okay, no.
All right, whoever wants to go first. I guess you could go first, Kazni.
Sure, sure. He's saying, what does it mean to, what's the word again? Multiply? Be fruitful and multiply?
It says so Genesis 1:28 says, and God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. That's the King James Version.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the uh, one of the main things that we get from this is, go and have kids and so on. But besides that, are you familiar with the parable of the seed or parable of
Um,
gifts?
Parable of
So when you
Gifts.
have the seeds and you have them and you throw them next to the thorns, you throw them on the path next to the sun, and you throw them on, good um mud where it's able to produce fruits, just as you have the parable of the gifts where, one person was giving 10 gifts or whatever number of gifts and the other was given five. And I think one was only given one gift, and the one that had 10 went and it multiplied to 100. The one that had five, I think it multiplied to 10 or so on. And the last one who only had one gift ended up just taking their gift and burying it. And at the time when the Savior, whoever within that parable came back, and he asked them what they do with their gifts, and he simply said, "Hey, I buried it, and here it is." I think with anything, we have a reason to contribute more to society. So, whatever it is that we receive, it's expected of us to contribute more. I think there's a famous quote by John F. Kennedy where he says, "Don't ask what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." And it's a sense of multiplying and just producing a lot more than what's given to you. That way, things can be better, whether it is for your generation or the next. So, those are my thoughts when this is presented.
I think there's like a sense of like there's a profoundness to it. It's like thinking about how we use our gifts
Yeah.
to be fruitful, not multiply in the sense of like, okay, what am I good at, and how can I leverage what I'm good at um, to um, optimize not only my fitness but my fitness in relation to other people's fitness and in relation to the fitness of the ecosystem. Because without appreciating, without um, being mindful of those three relations, I guess that's also a triality, the self, the others, and the ecosystem, right? There's a whole lot of trilations I can come up with. But we could also talk about this. Um, what's interesting about 3 points is you can have a bounded, like a whole bounded region. Well, you could have an interval between 2 points, but with 3 points, you have a whole higher dimensional space. You have a space in which um, stuff is enclosed. That is, if you have 3 points, that is the 3 points is the least amount of points to enclose sets in a higher dimensional region of space. So especially like a geometric space. Or just imagining, like envisioning like a collection of stuff in a space. You imagine like, okay, how can I have a container? If I was to make a container that was just a couple sticks that just contained some stuff in the sticks. But anyway, maybe that was a bad example. But where I was getting at is I think that yeah, I think that that is very profound in the sense of not uh I think some people probably poke jokes at it as thinking about it. It has to do with reproduction, but or maybe a lot of people take it the wrong way. But I think that it really has to do with how we optimize our judgment. Being fruitful, being uh, mindful of our judgment. Um, but yeah, I think that yeah, I was looking at that parable of the talents, Matthew 25:14-30. It makes me think about the the three wise men. I think that was for some reason. Let's see. I think that's right. Is it Matthew? One second. I think it's
As you look through
Matthew
this,
Matthew 2.
I'm gonna get ready to get going because I have to be somewhere else by 8. But I did enjoy this
Okay.
conversation a lot. All right,
Thank you
Jesse?
so much. I
Oh, of
appreciate
course.
it. Yeah, I think we've been going for a little over
About 2 hours.
about 2 hours. Okay. And Kevin's mic isn't working. All right. Well, I think this is a good place to leave off. It's been an exhausting latter half of the year for me, so my brain's all over the place. But I think I was able to have some fruitful conversation, and I appreciate you guys uh, are joining the dialogue. I think the next Bible study is going to be somewhere mid. I think it might be mid late January. So I'll keep you guys up to date. But thanks for joining. I
Of course, of
appreciate it.
course, of course. All
All
right.
right, take it easy.
You too.